the trade war and the US-China great power rivalry. That is also a very, very masculine narrative. And a lot of science and technology are being not just developed, but also propagandized, are being perceived in the public imagination as these kind of weapons, as these kinds of embodiments of masculine power. And if we look at some of these language that are technically encouraging more Chinese women to participate in science and technology, it is not so much about women's empowerment. It's about how Chinese women can also contribute to the development of the nation in science and technology. Like women is this untapped or undertapped labor force that can work even more.
Welcome. My name is Abigail Coplin, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology and science, technology, and society at Vassar College. I'm also a member of the 7th cohort of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Public Intellectual Program. This September will mark the 30th anniversary of Beijing hosting the 4th United Nations World Conference on Women. I'm here to lead a conversation discussing both this conference's legacies and the opportunities and barriers faced by Chinese women today in a field near and dear to my heart, science and technology. I am ecstatic to be joined by two distinguished panelists, Dr. Yangyang Cheng and Dr. Gina Tam. Dr. Cheng is a research scholar at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, where her work focuses on the development of science and technology in China and in US-China relations. Previously, she worked as a particle physicist for over a decade and was born and raised in China. Dr. Tam is an associate professor of history and the co-director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Her first book, Dialect and Nationalism in China, focused on the interplay of language policy and national identity in 20th century China. Currently, she is writing a book about women activists in post-war Hong Kong. Let's get to our discussion. In 1995, Beijing hosted the Fourth World Conference on Women. What was the impact on women at China at the time, and how might we see the conference's legacy today? Gina, why don't you take this one?
Sure. Thanks so much for the great introduction, Abigail. So in 1995, the All Women's Conference in Beijing and the accompanying NGO Forum, which was held in Huairao, was a really historic moment. It was the fourth UN conference on women, but it was the first held in Asia, which means it was the first time that issues facing women in Asia were in the spotlight. And this was particularly meaningful for PRC feminist activists. For a number of reasons, right? Long dismissed on the one hand by an international community that was more focused on powerful democratic countries and pretty dismissive of the experiences of Chinese women since sort of like with Cold War legacies and such. And they were also constrained on the other hand by their own government, which was wary of grassroots activism. So the conference offered them a really rare spotlight, a moment where their stories for once were heard at home and abroad, and also gave them really unparalleled opportunity to build community and forge solidarity with feminists around the world. And importantly, it wasn't just the conference that did this. There were years of preparation and research and information gathering that went into the meeting. And these efforts stayed well into the conference. One woman I interviewed remembers female friends of hers who had never thought about structural gender inequality suddenly being empowered to talk about it, right? And use that kind of verbiage, which was really meaningful, right? Another woman recalls going door to door with women in her community, asking them about the issues they would like to be spotlighted. And so it really brought attention at just sort of like the very basic grassroots to the experiences of PRC women. It wasn't just awareness, however, it also spurred a lot of structural changes, right? The global nature of the UN conference created opportunities for transnational exchange, which facilitated Chinese women's participation in transnational organizations and events and introduced Chinese feminists to new ideas and strategies, words like gender mainstreaming suddenly becoming sort of popular in places in China. There was a Chinese translation of the vagina monologues at Zhongshan University in 2004, right? And so these kinds of international exchanges really mattered. And there's a lot to be critical about with how the Chinese state has historically and today approached the question of gender, many of which we'll, I'm sure, get into in this discussion. In the wake of the 1995 conference, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government began expressing a desire to integrate gender equality into its state structure. I mean, Again, this is sort of like the ideal of it, right? But like that verbiage ended up being embedded into state institutions. Local feminists who collaborated with state institutions were able to create, say, local gender training units to raise awareness on gender issues throughout the local government, or vocational training for rural women, research institutes focused on studying gender. And these kinds of things became part of the state infrastructure. But, and this is sort of the where I'll the last thing I'll say here, and if you take anything from the introduction, I hope it's this: these realities do not necessarily represent a steady progressive path towards gender equity. Indeed, in the past decade or so, new policy decisions by the state have in some ways made it more difficult to advocate for women than it was in 1995. And I'll give very two brief examples. First, one of the ways that Chinese women advocated for themselves was through non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. But since 2017, the foreign NGO law has made NGO work really, really difficult, if not effectively impossible, and has most importantly, or not most importantly, but one of the facets of this has cut off almost all of the international ties that were forged at the UN conference. Another example is that, or sort of thing that has happened in the last decade that I think we need to keep in mind here, is that the current government under Xi Jinping has increasingly leaned into what a scholar, Leda Hong-Fincher, has called patriarchal authoritarianism, or an authoritarian system that garners power through strengthening of patriarchal structures. We can see this patriarchal authoritarianism in growing pro-natalist policies, de-investment in pathways for female leadership, and the guiding of public opinion, both subtly and very overtly sometimes, towards encouraging strict gender roles. And so these are just two examples that I want to point to show that why we I don't want us to think of this as sort of a straight trajectory forward, that in some ways the state is in some ways more hostile towards gender equality than it was actually in 1995.
As Dr. Tam highlights, the world has changed a lot since the 1995 conference, both in terms of women's position in the labor force and society generally, but also in terms of China's position within the global science and technology ecosystem. Let's talk a bit about recent history of science and technology in China. How has it evolved? How has the role of women in STEM evolved with it? Professor Cheng, why don't you take this one?
Thank you so much. And I will just mention one thing is that I did not know the 1995 Women's Conference in real time, but I do remember in the 2000s when I was learning English, and one of my earliest impressions of the English language had echoes of Hillary Clinton saying women's rights are human rights. And one of the things was actually the Chinese Women's Association for Science and Technology was founded in 1993 as part of the preparation for the 1995 conference. Though to discuss this, I would like to take a little step back into the earlier era, into the Mao era. Partly it's because scientists, including women scientists who were trained in the Mao era, also became teachers and role models for a later generation of Chinese scientists. So there is a direct lineage. On the other hand, there are also parallels and echoes when we think about how science and technology are perceived in a gendered way. And so in the Mao era, of course, national defense was prioritized in terms of science technology development. And for Chinese nuclear programs, a lot of these bases were in the Northwest, and they dispatched a lot of men to work on these bases. And so there were very few women. And this became a problem, not just a social problem, but a security concern that there are so many bachelors. And so what the Chinese authorities did was to expand some of the logistical services, like to have more women to go dispatched to the northwestern frontiers to work as store clerks, to work as nurses on these nuclear and missile testing bases. And I find this element really interesting was, of course, like there was gender disparity at these nuclear test sites. But one way to work on that is to encourage more women to become nuclear scientists. On the other hand, it is also that men can also be store clerks or nurses. So there is no particular reason that it has to be women to work in these logistical roles. And so it is really interesting that when these women are being assigned to work in these regions far from their hometown, it was not so much about their career development or their personal realization, but it was for a very explicit goal that they are to be the spouses and to perform not just a productive but reproductive duty for the men who are building the nuclear shield for the nation. And then, of course, like the Mao era, there were many political campaigns where scientists were among the most persecuted groups, and there was great devastation to the science and education sectors in China. And then in the post-Mao era, with a new generation of technocrats, many of whom are actually veterans of the nuclear and space programs since around like the late 1970s, And one of the importance of science and technology in Chinese governance at the time was that it was not just important for China's development, but it was also an important source of political legitimacy, that a new era of Chinese leadership was trying to distinguish itself from an earlier era of the Mao era disasters. And of course, we know that a number of Chinese missile scientists played an important role in designing the one-child policy and the family planning policies. And some actually used the functions to calculate the missile trajectories, to project population growth, and then commented that actually the latter, population growth, had fewer variables than aerodynamics, which is, of course, a very interesting patriarchal imagination of thinking of women's bodies are just like these machines that you can click a button and it fires or not. But then one of the elements about the one-child policy is it did have a consequence that women, daughters who are the only child, received, especially in urban regions, received effectively equal access to education compared with sons. And so by the time, let's say mid to late 2000s, actually women and men have reached about parity in terms of access to higher education. And to this day, actually, women outnumber men in terms of admissions to universities. However, this dynamic still embodies a lot of disparities in terms of in science and engineering fields that women are still severely underrepresented, and especially in senior managerial positions that we can unpack a bit later. But I would also just conclude on one note, touching on what Gina had just said, that in the current Xi Jinping era, it was really, really interesting in terms of, on one hand, China is no longer like this impoverished backwater, but has become a superpower and is positioning itself as not just economic, but science and technology superpower. And as a modern nation, elevating women's status and having women contribute to science and technology fulfills not just a development goal, but a propaganda goal for the Chinese state. On the other hand, it is also in tension with the state's patriarchal, misogynistic narrative on one hand, ideologically speaking, and its pronatalist policies facing a demographic crisis on the other hand, pragmatically speaking. And so under this technoscience imaginary, we see a lot of these propaganda videos and documentaries that the Chinese government and the state media organs have released more recently, like 大国重器, the heavy machinery for a great nation, or 超级工程, China's mega projects. If we borrow the terminology from the sociologist David Nye, it's the technological sublime. So in a way, Chinese women, with an echo to the Mao era, their productive and reproductive labor are still being harnessed to fulfill this very patriarchal imagination in terms of science, technology, and national development.
Fascinating. I want to pull on the thread a little bit more. Like you alluded in your comments just now, Dr. Cheng, that women are underrepresented in many of these fields in science and technology. In what ways specifically, and why do you think this is? To both of you, what are the main impediments that women in STEM and in Chinese society more generally are facing right now, beyond kind of these machinations reinforcing patriarchal control?
I can start by talking a little bit about the job market, and then I think
Uh,
Dr. Chung can talk more in depth about STEM in particular. But I think it's worth talking just like more broadly about the job market. So, in brief, over the past several decades since the Mao era, women have seen a declining participation in the workforce. Meanwhile, those who are working suffer from an over 20% wage gap in both hourly and salaried wages. The most vulnerable are those who have less education, those that are older, and those that have rural hukou, but nearly all women are affected by these trends. And even in those sectors where women are well represented, or sectors where their representation is growing, as Dr. Chung already mentioned, right? They're often absent from managerial or leadership roles, right? In some, the portrait we have today is not great, and signs do not point to them going better. The reason that women have struggled are really multifaceted, resulting from a complex interplay of economic factors, social factors, and policy decisions. And I can't address anywhere near to all of them, but I'll highlight two to me. Right. The first is the pronatalist stance, right? Or to put it another way, right? A really huge focus on women um as people who are responsible for reproduction, right? And so, in the past decade, the party has really retreated from policies meant to support women in employment and have instead focused on encouraging them to be mothers and to give birth. And even some policies that, in theory, are meant to protect or help women, such as longer maternity leaves, without sort of broader structural forces, have ended up leaving women more disadvantaged as they lead to further discrimination against them by employers who see the benefits of a longer maternity leave as an extra cost to them. Right. A second example revolves around deep seated cultural discrimination. This is not only against women in the workplace, where women have very little recourse to address the kinds of sexual harassment and gender discrimination that drive women out of the workforce altogether, but also at home, where partners still expect women to pull what scholars will call the double shift, right? So you go to work for 8 hours and then you come home and you do all the domestic labor, right? So the double shift at work. Um, the expectations of a double shift make it really difficult for women to concentrate on career advancement, and to sort of live like full, satisfying, meaningful lives, right? Sort of online discourse won't often use the term double shift, right? But there's a growing expectation that women are expected to do these domestic duties, right? So these are two realities that hinder women's ability to thrive in STEM that reflect to me the complex interplay of economic, cultural, and social factors that reinforce patriarchal structures in China, all of which are furthered directly or indirectly by policy. So that's just a couple of examples, but I'll let Dr. Chung talk a little bit more about how this plays out more specifically in STEM field.
Dr. Chung, do you have anything to add specifically around issues of kind of the talent pipeline in science and technology?
Yeah, so when I was in high school in the early to mid 2000s in a provincial city in China, my high school math teacher told us this story. It's a Xiaoming, which is basically like James in Chinese. Xiaoming's dad tells Xiaoming that the male to female ratio in China is 107 to 101. So if you do not study hard enough, you are going to be left over six. Xiaoming worked really hard and got into the University of Science and Technology of China, where the male to female ratio is 7 to 1, where he is still one of the leftover six. And so a couple of years after I heard this story, I became a student at the University of Science and Technology of China. And it is actually really, really interesting that alumni have done a statistical analysis of the gender ratios at USTC from 1977 to the mid 2010s when the statistics were collected. And this was like the first admissions after the Cultural Revolution when college entrance resumed. And that ratio has stayed relatively consistently, not quite 7 to 1, though that is on the higher end, but more or less 5 to 1. And this is interesting because when USTC was founded in 1958, or in the 1950s, when like higher education started in the Mao era, there is great gender disparity, but it's not so much leaning towards one discipline versus the other. And nowadays, when there is effective parity or leaning more towards women in terms of receiving higher education, this gender disparity at about, on average, not so extreme on national average with regards to men and women in science and technology as compared with my alma mater's case, but it's still very consistently about like 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, especially in disciplines like physics or computer science. And there is more women in disciplines like chemistry, biosciences, and agricultural studies. And so there is a very gendered perception of which are the soft sciences and which are the hard sciences. And when we go into the workplace, actually, there is a perception that women have a greater preference for staying in academia or receiving further education if they had majored in STEM compared with their male peers. And there are a number of reasons for this. On one hand, there is a gendered perception that like women are more suited to be teachers while men become entrepreneurs. On the other hand, there is also pragmatic reason is that a lot of Chinese in the private sector, the gender discrimination is in many ways worse or more explicit. And many women feel if they had majored in STEM in college, have very few opportunities for career advancement if they could get a job at all in R&D sectors in a private firm. And so going to government or working at the university are some of the more preferable career choices. And when we come to the area of academia, there is still a great disparity, especially the higher up one goes. Like there is effective parity in terms of women and men receiving master's degrees, but there is still many more men receiving master's degrees in the sciences. And when we come to the PhD level, there is very, very few women. And there is this idea that even when I was younger, the saying was there are three genders: men, women, and female PhDs. And this a similar disparity is reflected at the professorial level, that the higher professional rank one goes, the fewer women there is. And if we look at some of these statistics, women receive grants from the national funding agencies at a lower rate than men. And also, very, very importantly, women are severely underrepresented on the grant review panels for the China's National Science Foundation. And then I'll finally mention one statistic, that is because we know publish or perish, that is an important criteria in academia. And there is one study that compared the number of papers published in two 5-year periods, 2005 to 2009 and 2015 to 2019. And in both periods, men published more than women. In both periods, both genders have published more a decade later, but men published significantly more compared with women, so the gender gap had widened. However, it doesn't mean that women were less productive. If we also compare the statistics, men are more likely to be corresponding authors, taking the major credit for the work, while women are more likely to be first authors, who are doing the bulk of the labor. So I'll conclude here and
Fabulous. Well, we've now talked briefly about history. We've talked briefly about the present. Let's turn to the future. How are changing gender relations changing the STEM field? And inversely, how are evolutions of science and technology changing gender equity and inequality? This question is to both of you.
I can go ahead and start first. So I'm a historian and I'm always deeply uncomfortable offering predictions. But what I will do is talk a little bit about sort of where I think things are now and trends I'm looking at that make me worried about what might happen in the future. First, the pronatalist like movement within the PRC, both statewide, but also just in sort of like popular opinion, does not seem to be slowing down. It also is emboldened because we can see sort of like on just like in sort of like on the internet, the cross exchange of pronatalist ideas in a transnational sense, right? Like ideas that are gaining steam in say the United States or in Europe, in terms of sort of men's rights activists and that kind of stuff, are also finding their way into Chinese online spaces. And that I think sort of emboldens this push to force traditional gender roles onto women. As a result, say the idea of like the second shift, rather than being seen as a problem, is being defended and normalized, right? This is what women are supposed to do. I'm not particularly an economist here, but the trade war, to the best of my knowledge, has led to a decline in manufacturing jobs. And given that the trade war is only escalating, and there are a few signs of reversal, that is also sort of troubling, I think, in terms of thinking about like sort of like uh, job opportunities and economic mobility for women, right? Women who were in manufacturing jobs are more and more moving towards informal employment options or service jobs, which require different skills, sometimes have lower pay, and often do not have a lot of employment protections, right? And so that worries me too. And finally, there are a few signs that Beijing is opening up new space for grassroots advocacy. A lot of where we saw gains for women's and like programs for women was through the collaboration between state organs and local feminist organizations. And right now, because there is this push for pronatalist policies, it's really difficult for even women who want to sort of address gender inequality within the state to have spaces to do that. And there's also not a lot of space outside the state to advocate for women, right? And there are few signs that I can see that there are any changes to that in the works. So to me, that's where I sort of see the lay of the land for gender in general. But I'll throw it to Dr. Chung.
I could hear Dr. Tam and Dr. Coplin talk forever, but so okay, I'll start with a little anecdote. This was after I had graduated at the USTC, the computer science lab, where it's what's called the AI lab at the time, wanted to design a robot. And its ambition was to have this do home service, domestic service. And this was quite pioneering at the time, because the idea was foreseeing this demographic shift in China, that there would be more need for this women's labor labor when there are not enough women of working age. And to design this robot, they did a campus-wide beauty pageant and selected the looks of the top few women students and then somehow combined their features. And then that is how they designed the face or the body of the features of the robot. And this was fascinating to me that, as I know Dr. Tam has mentioned in other occasions, this current push for so-called AI even when it is not necessarily physically embodied in a form beyond computer code and chips, but it is also trying to like recreate this kind of like a female servant or a secretary. And so there is a very gendered imagination there. And this is related to women's role in science and technology when there is one concept I will borrow from the sociologist Cora Ling Xu is her a fabulous new book, The Time Inheritors, right? The idea of time, where in particular women are always being pushed as if they're running out of time. They need to like advance at school early because men have more potential. They need to get married, find a husband and get married and have babies and as quickly as they can. And if their professional trajectories had some pauses because of family responsibilities, and then they're often discouraged, saying that they're too old and too whether too old to get married or too old to have a different professional career. And so I think this concept of time, of course, is highly tied with the ideas of science and technological development. And what is also very important to point out here is that when a lot of discussions about women in science or women in STEM have focused on representation and diversity on a demographic level, it does not mean that more women in the field would necessarily make the field less patriarchal in terms of what kind of science and technology are being pursued. One analogy I would make is in the legal profession. Actually, the legal profession is highly favored by women, especially if they work as like prosecutors or lower level judges. These fields are actually very much dominated by women in China, but Chinese law is still very patriarchal, including a lot of the newer provisions that explicitly discriminate against women in terms of divorces, in terms of access and retaining of property. And so I would like to close on a note here that also related to what Dr. Tam said with regards to like the trade war and the U.S.-China great power rivalry. That is also a very, very masculine narrative, and a lot of science and technology are being not just developed but also propagandized, are being perceived in the public imagination as these kind of weapons, as these kinds of embodiments of masculine power. And if we look at some of these language that are technically encouraging more Chinese women to participate in science and technology, it is not so much about women's empowerment. It's about how Chinese women can also contribute to the development of the nation in science and technology. Like women is this untapped or undertapped labor force that can work even more. And so that does not bode very well for the future. However, I would also like to think that because the path is contingent, like it is not predetermined. One analogy I like to make is, for example, astronomy, right? The mapping of the stars, on one hand, it helped guide colonial expansion with the sea navigations. On the other hand, people like Harriet Tubman also looked at the stars in mapping their paths to freedom. So there, even a similar type of technology or scientific knowledge can be imagined and used in different ways. And I do think that Chinese women being pushed and marginalized actually have a unique position to imagine a different type of scientific development and national power.
That is an amazing point to end on. Time flies when one is engaged in such stimulating conversation, and thus, unfortunately, we find ourselves reaching our cutoff already. Let me end by thanking both of our fabulous panelists for contributing their time and thoughts today. And let me likewise extend our collective gratitude to all the National Committee staff members who worked tirelessly to make this interview happen today. Finally, to our viewers, we hope that you found today's interview interesting and informative, and we hope that you will join us again for future National Committee programming.